I was walking through the park when a stranger tapped my shoulder. She smiled and said, "Your daughter is beautiful." I froze, completely confused, and told her I do not have a daughter. Her face suddenly fell. She said, "The little girl has been following you since the grocery store." I turned around and saw a little girl I had never seen before. The little girl took my hand and asked if we could go home now, Mommy. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your entire world turned upside down in a single afternoon. My name is Nyla. I am 31 years old, and I work as a senior forensic auditor. My sister Serena died 6 months ago. She was the golden child of our family, the perfect daughter who married a wealthy white man, while I was constantly treated like a disappointment. My parents always made sure I knew my place. I was the dark-skinned outcast who refused to join their flashy mega-church ministry, while Serena was their light-skinned trophy displayed for everyone to admire. Standing there in the park looking down at this 6-year-old black girl, my breath caught in my throat. She had Serena's exact eyes, her exact nose, and the exact same birthmark on her left cheek. I knelt down on the grass. My heart hammered against my ribs. I asked her what her name was. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes and whispered that her name was Arya. She clung to the straps of a faded pink backpack. I gently asked if I could look inside to find her parents. She nodded slowly. I unzipped the bag. Inside, I found a few old crayons, a worn-out blanket, and a crumpled piece of paper shoved into the bottom corner. I pulled the paper out and smoothed the wrinkles. It was a birth certificate. The name read Arya. I scanned down to the parent section. My blood ran cold. The mother listed was Serena. My sister had a 6-year-old daughter, a daughter nobody in our family knew about, a daughter who was kept entirely secret while my parents paraded Serena around as the perfect, dutiful wife to her rich husband, Preston. Before I could even process this massive revelation, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around. 2 large men stood looming over us. They wore dark suits that looked completely out of place for a sunny Saturday at the park. The taller one grabbed Arya by the arm. He told me to step aside because the kid belonged to them. Arya screamed and hid behind my legs, crying and begging me not to let them take her. I stepped directly in front of the little girl, shielding her with my body. I demanded to know who they were. The shorter man stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. He told me I was making a big mistake. He said I needed to walk away right now and pretend I never saw this kid. He reached into his jacket. They thought I was just some defenseless woman they could intimidate. They had no idea who they were dealing with. My job requires me to track down dangerous criminals who hide millions of dollars. I am trained to handle high-pressure situations. I deal with federal agents and corporate fraudsters every single day. I did not scream. I did not panic. I reached into my purse, moving slowly so they would think I was grabbing my wallet. Instead, my fingers wrapped around the canister of industrial-strength pepper spray I always carry. The tall man lunged forward to grab Arya again. I pulled the canister and sprayed a direct stream right into his eyes. He howled in pain, clutching his face and stumbling backward into his partner. The second man cursed and wiped his eyes, trying to see through the burning mist. I did not waste a single second. I scooped Arya into my arms and sprinted across the park toward my car. I could hear the men shouting behind me, but I did not look back. I reached my car, yanked the door open, and strapped Arya into the back seat. I slammed the door, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked all the doors just as the second man slammed his fists against my window. I hit the gas and sped away from the curb, leaving them behind in a cloud of dust. My chest heaved as I merged onto the highway. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Arya was clutching her backpack, trembling but safe. I tried to make sense of the madness. Why did my sister have a secret child? Why were strange men trying to abduct her in broad daylight? Why did this little girl look at me and call me mommy? My phone buzzed in the cup holder. I kept my eyes on the road, but tapped the screen to read the notification. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message made my blood freeze in my veins. It read, "Hand the kid over, or you will end up exactly like your sister." My sister supposedly died by accidentally falling down a flight of stairs. That was the story my parents and my brother-in-law Preston told the police. That was the story they sold to our church. But staring at that text message, I knew the truth. Serena did not fall. She was murdered. And whatever she was hiding was sitting right now in the back seat of my car. They wanted to threaten me. They wanted to silence me just like they silenced her, but they messed with the wrong sister. I pressed my foot down hard on the gas pedal. I was not going to run and hide. I was going to drive straight into the lion's den. The tires of my car screeched loudly as I took the sharp turn into the gated community of Oakwood Estates. I did not care about the speed limit or the neighborhood watch. My knuckles were completely white against the steering wheel, and my heart was beating a relentless, heavy rhythm in my chest. Beside me in the passenger seat, little Aria clutched her faded pink backpack. Her big brown eyes were wide with a heartbreaking mix of fear and exhaustion. I told her softly that everything was going to be fine, but my own voice sounded completely foreign to me. We pulled up to the sprawling driveway of my parents' massive estate. Expensive cars lined the entire street. They were luxury vehicles belonging to the elite elders, politicians, and wealthy donors of my father's megachurch. Today was the 6-month memorial of Serena passing. It was a perfectly orchestrated high society gathering designed to show the whole world how tragically beautiful their grief was. I killed the engine and took a deep breath. It was time to tear down their perfect facade. I unbuckled Aria and took her small, trembling hand in mine. We walked up the grand marble steps, and I pushed the heavy mahogany double doors open without even bothering to knock. The grand foyer was filled with the soft hum of classical music and the polite low chatter of people dressed in somber but incredibly expensive black designer clothes. In the center of the massive room, my mother Yvonne stood radiating her usual intimidating grace. She wore a tailored black suit that probably cost more than my first car, and she elegantly held a crystal champagne flute. Next to her stood my father, Bishop Terence, shaking hands and accepting condolences with a highly practiced, pious smile. And right beside them was Preston. The grieving white widower was soaking up the sympathy of the room while dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. I stepped fully into the bright light of the crystal chandelier, pulling Aria gently forward. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind me, and the sound echoed like a gunshot through the hall. The polite chatter died instantly. Dozens of judgmental eyes turned toward us. I watched the blood drain completely from Preston's smug face. His jaw went slack, and the silk handkerchief slipped right from his fingers, fluttering slowly to the marble floor. My mother turned her head to see what had silenced the entire room. When her eyes landed on the little girl holding my hand, her immaculate composure shattered into a million pieces. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp and crashed against the floor, sending expensive liquid and glass flying across the polished marble. I did not give them a single second to recover their breath or formulate a lie. I marched straight through the crowd. The wealthy church elders parted for me like the Red Sea, their eyes darting rapidly between my face and the exact miniature replica of my dead sister hiding behind my legs. I reached the display table where a massive framed portrait of Serena sat surrounded by dozens of white lilies. I reached into my purse, pulled out the crumpled piece of paper I had taken from the backpack, and slammed it down hard onto the glass tabletop. The slap of the paper rang out through the dead silent room. I looked directly into my mother's panicked eyes, and then shifted my cold gaze to my father. I demanded to know why my sister had a 6-year-old daughter that nobody in this entire family knew about. Preston took a heavy step backward, pulling nervously at his collar, as if he suddenly could not breathe. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. My father, Bishop Terence, looked down at the birth certificate on the table and then looked closely at Aria. For a tiny fraction of a second, I saw raw recognition flash in his eyes. He knew the truth. They all knew the truth. But my mother was a master of absolute manipulation. She had spent 30 years controlling the narrative of her megachurch empire, and she was not about to let me ruin her perfect tragedy. She stepped forward carefully, avoiding the broken glass on the floor, and let out a loud, highly theatrical gasp. "Nyla!" What is the meaning of this sick and twisted joke? My mother cried out, her voice carrying the perfect pitch of a heartbroken, grieving mother. She turned to the church elders and clutched her chest as if she was in physical pain. I stood my ground and pushed the birth certificate closer to her. I told her this was no joke and she needed to explain right now why my sister was forced to hide her own flesh and blood from the world. My mother let out a shrill, desperate laugh. She pointed a trembling finger at me and raised her voice so every single person in the foyer could hear her clearly. She told the crowd that I was having a severe psychotic break. She said the profound grief of losing my sister had finally pushed my fragile, jealous mind over the edge. I could not believe what I was hearing, but I honestly should have expected it. She turned fully to the crowd, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. She announced that I had always been insanely jealous of Serena and her perfect, flawless marriage to Preston. She told the gasping audience that I was so desperate for attention and money that I had actually hired a random street kid to come in here and extort the grieving widower. She looked at me with pure venom in her eyes and called me a sick individual for using an innocent child to tarnish my dead sister's pristine memory. A loud murmur of agreement washed through the crowd of church elders. They were buying her dramatic performance completely. I felt my fingernails digging deeply into my own palms. I told her to stop lying to these people. I told her she had spent my entire life hiding me in the shadows because my dark skin and quiet nature did not fit the glamorous, elite image of her megachurch royalty. I told her I knew she forced Serena to hide this beautiful child just to protect the multi-million-dollar wedding to Preston. My father stepped forward, his face purple with intense rage. He ordered me to shut my mouth and get out of his house immediately before he had me thrown out like the trash I was. Preston had finally recovered from his initial shock. The color returned to his face, and it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He realized the crowd was firmly on their side, and he immediately weaponized his privilege. He smoothed his expensive suit jacket and pulled a sleek smartphone from his pocket. He looked down at me, with a smirk full of pure, aristocratic arrogance. He announced to the room that he was not going to tolerate this disgusting extortion attempt from a deranged and bitter woman. He tapped the screen of his phone and held it up for me to see. He told me he was calling the police chief right now. He said they played golf every single Sunday, and the chief would be more than happy to send a squad car immediately to deal with a trespasser. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper that only I could hear. He said, "It is time you get locked in a psych ward, Nyla, where you can never ever hurt this family again." The wail of police sirens pierced the tense silence of the grand foyer before Preston even had the chance to put his phone back in his pocket. His golf buddy, the police chief, had clearly made sure a squad car was waiting nearby, just in case they needed to clear out unwanted guests. The heavy mahogany doors swung open again, and 4 uniformed officers rushed into the mansion. Their hands were resting heavily on their utility belts, and their eyes swept the room looking for a threat. The moment the police arrived, Preston instantly completely changed his demeanor. The vicious, arrogant monster who had just threatened me vanished into thin air. In his place stood a wealthy, distressed widower seeking immediate protection from the authorities he basically owned. He stepped forward, smoothing his expensive suit jacket, and pointed a perfectly manicured finger right at my face. He told the lead officer that I was deeply disturbed and dangerous. He claimed I had burst into his wife's memorial service and was trying to extort his grieving family using a child I had abducted from the streets. He demanded that they arrest me immediately and take the little girl away to a shelter. My mother jumped right on cue to support his massive lie. She pressed her hands to her face and let out a dramatic, echoing sob. She begged the officers to please be gentle with me because her daughter was sick and had completely lost her mind. My father stood tall beside her, nodding gravely to the officers like a wise religious leader carrying a heavy emotional burden. They were throwing me to the wolves without a single second of hesitation, just to protect their precious image and their wealthy son-in-law. The lead officer stepped toward me, unfastening the leather strap on his handcuffs. He told me to step away from the child and place my hands behind my back right now. Arya squeezed her eyes shut and buried her face into my legs, trembling uncontrollably as the men in uniform closed in on us. I did not move a single inch. I did not let the panic show on my face. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and hit record. I held it up high, making sure the camera captured Preston, my parents, and the officers approaching me. I stated my full name clearly and announced to the room that this entire interaction was now being recorded for legal purposes and federal documentation. The lead officer stopped in his tracks and ordered me to put the device away. He warned me that I was interfering with police business and making things much worse for myself by resisting arrest. I looked the officer dead in the eyes and refused. My voice did not shake even a little bit. I told him he was standing in the middle of a civil family dispute, and he had absolutely no jurisdiction to remove a child from my care without a signed warrant from a judge. Preston scoffed loudly from across the room, his face twisting with annoyance. He told the cops to stop wasting time listening to a crazy woman and just put me in cuffs already. He reminded the officer that he personally funded the new police cruisers last year and expected them to do their jobs without asking questions. The officer took another step toward me, reaching for my arm with a stern look on his face. I calmly stepped back and began reciting the exact state family law statutes regarding child welfare and custody disputes. My voice rang out crystal clear over the whispers of the church elders. I informed the police that without a court-appointed guardian ad litem present, physically seizing a child without proof of imminent danger was a direct violation of federal civil rights. I told the officer that if he wrongfully touched me or this little girl, his career would be over before the sun went down. Preston laughed, a cold, incredibly arrogant sound that echoed in the vast room. He told the police I was just a lowly accountant spouting nonsense. I read on the internet to sound smart. He demanded they take the kid right now and stop letting a hysterical woman dictate the law. I did not even look at Preston. I kept my eyes locked solely on the lead officer. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a thick folded document. I flicked it open and pressed it firmly against the officer's chest. I told him to read it very carefully before he made the biggest mistake of his life and ruined his pension. It was an emergency protective order. My family thought I was just some basic corporate drone working a dead-end desk job. They had no idea that as a senior forensic auditor working covertly with federal agencies, I knew exactly how to navigate the legal system better than any of them. I knew how to fast-track paperwork through judges who actually respected the law over dirty megachurch money. I explained to the room that a federal judge had signed that document exactly 1 hour ago. It granted me 48-hour emergency physical custody of Arya until a formal hearing could be convened. The lead officer scanned the document, and I watched the aggressive confidence drain completely out of his face. He saw the official federal seal and the judge's signature staring back at him. He swallowed hard and handed the paper back to me with a nervous nod. He turned around to face Preston and shook his head. He explained that his hands were completely tied. The paperwork was ironclad and legitimate. He said the police could not legally touch me or the child, and that this was now a matter for the family courts to decide. The look of absolute shock on Preston's face was priceless. His white privilege and his massive bank account had just violently collided with a brick wall of actual federal law. He turned completely red with rage. He cursed at the officers, telling them they were entirely useless and threatening to have their badges by tomorrow morning. The officers awkwardly backed away, muttering quiet apologies to the wealthy donors as they quickly exited the mansion through the heavy doors, leaving Preston fuming. The grand foyer fell into a dead, suffocating silence once again. The elite church crowd stared at me in stunned disbelief. Nobody had ever stood up to Preston and won. Nobody had ever humiliated the powerful bishop and his glamorous first lady in their own home and walked away unscathed. I bent down and scooped Arya into my arms. She wrapped her small arms tightly around my neck and buried her face in my shoulder, holding on for dear life. I turned to leave the suffocating room and walk out into the fresh air. Suddenly, my father stepped directly into my path, blocking the exit. Bishop Terrence loomed over me, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The pious holy man facade was completely gone. He leaned down close to my face, so the gossiping church elders could not hear the poison spilling from his mouth. He asked me if I really thought I could just waltz in here and dare to defy Preston and this family without facing massive consequences. His breath was hot and shaking with deep anger. He told me I was making the worst mistake of my pathetic life. He stared at me with eyes full of utter hatred and delivered his final threat. He said, "By tomorrow morning, you will be completely penniless." He told me he would personally see to it that I lost everything, just like the time he maliciously cut my college tuition to punish me for not bowing to his rules. He promised he would use every shady connection he had to destroy my career, empty my bank accounts, and leave me begging on the streets. He said I was going to pay dearly for disrespecting the empire he built. I stood there holding the exact replica of my dead sister in my arms. I looked back at the man who was supposed to protect me, but only ever saw me as a burden. I felt absolute ice running through my veins. I did not flinch, and I did not back down. The morning sun felt heavy as I pulled into the parking garage of the downtown accounting firm where I supposedly worked. I had barely slept at all. Arya was safely tucked away at a secure location with a highly trusted friend who knew how to keep quiet, but my mind was constantly racing with my father's vicious threats from the night before. I grabbed my briefcase from the passenger seat and walked up to the grand glass entrance doors of the building. I reached for my lanyard and swiped my employee badge against the security scanner just like I had done every single morning for the past 2 years. The light flashed a harsh, angry red, and the heavy glass doors remained locked tight. I tried it again, thinking it was just a glitch in the system, but the scanner buzzed with a loud, harsh rejection tone that echoed in the empty morning lobby. Before I could even figure out what was happening, the heavy glass doors were pushed open from the inside by 2 armed corporate security guards. The head of security, a man named David, who I had shared coffee with just last week, stepped forward with a cheap cardboard box in his hands. He would not even look me in the eye as he stood blocking my path. He cleared his throat and told me my employment had been terminated, effective immediately, by a direct order from the board of directors. He said a major shareholder had flagged my file for gross misconduct and breach of contract. I knew exactly who that major shareholder was. Preston had wasted absolutely no time weaponizing his wealth and his white privilege against me. He wanted to remind me exactly who held the power in this city. Right on cue, my cell phone vibrated deep in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and saw Preston's private number flashing on the bright screen. I answered it and pressed the phone to my ear without saying a single word. His smug, arrogant voice filled my ear immediately. He let out a dark chuckle and asked how my morning commute was going. He told me a college dropout loser like me should have known better than to play silly games with a man who owned half the city real estate. He said he hoped I did not need to buy any groceries for my stolen new kid because my father had just called in a few personal favors at the bank. My personal checking and savings accounts were completely frozen under the pretense of a highly suspicious fraud investigation. They were using their megachurch connections to starve me out and cut off all my resources. Preston told me I had exactly 1 hour to hand the kid over to Child Protective Services, or things would get unimaginably worse for me. He said if I complied and begged for his forgiveness, he might be generous enough to make a call and unfreeze my accounts so I could afford a cheap bus ticket out of town. He told me to learn my place, and remember that black women who cause trouble for him always end up broken. He laughed one last time and hung up the phone, leaving me listening to the dead air. The security guards stood there gripping their belts, waiting for me to break down and cry. My former co-workers were slowly gathering near the lobby windows, whispering and pointing at the disgraced woman being thrown out onto the street like common garbage. They expected a massive emotional scene. They expected me to fall to my knees and beg for my job back, or scream about the extreme injustice of it all. They truly thought they had just ruined my entire life in a matter of minutes. I looked down at the pathetic cardboard box holding a few fake plastic plants and some cheap company pens. I did not shed a single tear. I did not beg or scream or plead my case to men who were paid to ignore me. Instead, a slow and totally genuine smile spread across my face. I told the security guards they could keep the box and the trash inside it. I turned around and walked right out of the corporate plaza with my head held high and my spine straight. I walked 3 blocks down the busy city street until I found a quiet, independent coffee shop tucked away in an alley. I ordered a black coffee paid with a $20 bill I kept in my shoe and sat at a small, wobbly table in the very back corner facing the front door. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out my real laptop. It was not the cheap plastic machine the accounting firm had issued me. It was a heavy, matte, black encrypted device issued directly by the federal government. My family and my arrogant brother-in-law thought I was just a low-level number cruncher who got lucky landing a mediocre corporate job. They eagerly believed the false narrative they had created about me being a failure and a dropout. What they did not know was that my corporate accounting job was nothing but a carefully constructed cover story. I was actually a senior forensic auditor working covertly for the Internal Revenue Service and federal law enforcement. My specific specialty was tracking down and dismantling high-level financial crimes and utterly destroying arrogant men who thought their dirty money made them untouchable. I opened the heavy laptop and quickly bypassed 3 separate layers of advanced biometric security. I logged directly into the classified Federal Criminal Investigation database. The bright screen illuminated my face with endless rows of green encrypted text and financial codes. Preston thought freezing my small personal checking account was a masterstroke of raw power. He had absolutely no idea that I currently held the federal authority to freeze his entire financial empire with just a few careful keystrokes. I typed his full name and his corporate tax identification numbers into the global tracking system. I bypassed his clean domestic accounts completely and went straight for the hidden offshore shell companies he used to funnel the untaxed megachurch donations. I watched with deep satisfaction as a massive tangled web of illegal wire transfers began to unfold right before my eyes on the glowing screen. He had been moving millions of dollars through fake shell charities for years, living a life of supreme luxury on stolen funds. My father thought he could threaten to leave me penniless and broken. But as I tracked the offshore routing numbers connecting Preston's stolen wealth directly to my parents' shady church accounts, I knew exactly who was going to be left begging on the streets by the time I was done with them. I closed my encrypted laptop and slid it back into my leather briefcase. The offshore routing numbers I had just discovered were a massive web of deceit. But I could not stay at the coffee shop any longer. I had to get back to the safe house. I left the coffee shop through the back alley and made my way to the unmarked sedan I had rented under an assumed name. I drove across the city, taking a convoluted route to ensure nobody was following me. The safe house was an anonymous brick building in an industrial park. It belonged to an old colleague from my federal training days who owed me his life. It was completely off the grid and practically a fortress. I unlocked the heavy steel door and stepped inside the dimly lit room. My friend gave me a silent nod and quietly slipped out the back, leaving me alone with Arya. The little girl was sitting exactly where I had left her earlier that morning. She was curled into a tiny ball on the edge of the leather sofa. Her knees were pulled tightly to her chest and she was staring blankly at the blank concrete wall. The severe trauma of losing her mother and then almost being kidnapped by strange men in suits had completely shattered her. She had not spoken a single word since we fled the park. She just sat there completely mute and shivering in the cool air of the safe house. I walked over slowly and sat on the floor near the sofa so I would not tower over her and scare her further. I spoke in the softest voice I could manage, telling her that she was safe and nobody was going to hurt her ever again. She did not look at me. Instead, her small fingers dug deeper into the matted fur of a brown stuffed bear she had pulled from her faded pink backpack. The bear looked incredibly old and worn out. One of its plastic button eyes was missing, and the fur was patched and discolored from years of love. As I watched her thumb nervously rub the back of the bear, I noticed something incredibly strange. The thread running down the main seam of the bear's back was entirely different from the rest of the original stitching. The original thread was a faded tan color, but the thread along the spine was bright, heavy-duty black nylon. It was thick and knotted clumsily, as if someone had hastily sewn it shut in a blind panic. My forensic training immediately kicked in. People who hide things always leave a trail, and my sister was running for her life when she died. I gently reached out and placed my hand over Aria's small, trembling fingers. I asked her if I could look at her bear for just a second to fix it. She hesitated for a long time, her wide brown eyes finally meeting mine. She slowly loosened her tight grip and let me take the stuffed toy from her hands. I turned the bear over and ran my fingers along the thick black stitching. There was a hard, rigid lump hidden deep inside the soft cotton stuffing. My heart started hammering violently against my ribs. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a small pocket knife. I whispered an apology to Arya and carefully sliced through the thick black nylon thread. I pulled the old fabric apart and reached inside the stuffing. My fingers brushed against cold, hard plastic. I pulled it out and held it up to the dim light of the safe house. It was a small black USB drive. Arya watched me with wide, fearful eyes as I set the bear down next to her and pulled my encrypted laptop back out. I booted up the machine and bypassed the heavy security protocols once again. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the tiny plastic drive. Whatever my sister had hidden inside this toy was the key to this entire nightmare. It was the exact reason she was murdered, and the reason my parents were willing to destroy my entire life to get this child back. I pushed the drive into the USB port. A single video file popped up on the black screen. The file name was simply for Nyla. I took a deep, steadying breath and clicked play. The screen flickered and then Serena's face filled the monitor. She looked absolutely terrible. The glamorous, polished trophy wife image I had known my entire life was completely gone. Her hair was a tangled mess. Her face was badly bruised, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She was sitting in what looked like a dark closet, whispering frantically into the camera. The sound of her broken voice shattered my heart into a million pieces. Serena looked directly into the lens and started crying uncontrollably. She said, "Nyla, if you are watching this, it means I am gone and you found Arya." She choked on a heavy sob and covered her mouth to muffle the sound. She said she was so incredibly sorry. She apologized for being a coward and for standing by silently while our parents treated me like absolute trash my entire life. She said she was too weak to fight their manipulation, and she let them destroy my self-worth just so she could keep the peace in the family. Hearing my perfect sister admit the ugly truth after all these years felt like a physical blow to my chest, but the heartfelt apologies were just the beginning. Serena leaned closer to the camera, her eyes darting around nervously in the dark. She said, "I need you to know the dark truth about Preston and the church." She revealed that Preston was not a wealthy businessman at all. His entire fortune was a complete lie fabricated by our greedy parents. She told me Preston was actually a glorified criminal laundering millions of dollars of untaxed megachurch donations through offshore shell companies. Our parents used his fake elite status to attract wealthier donors, and Preston used the megachurch to wash his dirty money. They were all equal partners in a massive federal financial crime ring. Serena wiped her bruised face and pulled a folded piece of paper into the frame. She said they forced her to marry him to keep the illegal secret safe within the family. Then she looked down and her voice completely shattered. She said, "Arya is not Preston's child. Arya is the daughter of my first love, Marcus, the boy our father violently ran out of town because he was poor and black." She confessed that when she got pregnant, our parents were absolutely terrified the scandal would ruin the pristine church image and destroy the lucrative marriage arrangement with Preston. They forced Serena to hide her pregnancy from the entire world. They sent her away claiming she was on a long missionary trip overseas. When Arya was born, our parents immediately ripped the newborn baby from her arms. They locked Arya away in a private, secretive facility funded entirely by dirty church money. Serena wept openly as she described the sheer agony of visiting her daughter in secret for 6 long years, playing the dutiful, happy wife while her heart was completely broken. She said she finally gathered the courage to steal Arya back and expose the entire money laundering operation to the feds. But Preston found out about her plan. Serena whispered that Preston was coming for her right now, and she had to hide the evidence fast. She begged me to protect Arya and use my forensic skills to tear down their corrupt, evil empire. She said, "You were always the strongest one, Nyla. You are the only one who can stop them." The video suddenly glitched, and Serena looked off camera with pure, absolute terror in her eyes. The screen went completely black. I sat there frozen, staring at the dark monitor as the horrifying truth washed over me. Before I could even process the massive magnitude of the betrayal, a loud booming sound echoed through the small safe house. Someone was pounding violently on the heavy steel door. The booming sound of the pounding at the safe house door felt like a physical threat, but I did not move an inch away from my laptop. I did not have time to be terrified because my brain was already shifting into high gear. I grabbed the burner phone from my pocket and checked the industrial park security camera feed. It was just the building manager dropping off a delivery for my colleague. I let out a long, shaky breath and turned back to Arya, who was still staring at the blank concrete wall. I needed to keep her calm while I prepared to go on the offensive. The next morning was Sunday, and I knew exactly what was coming. I sat in the dark for hours planning every move and gathering every scrap of digital evidence I had pulled from the offshore accounts. When the sun finally rose, I was already logged into the live stream of the Sunday service at the Kingdom Harvest megachurch. The production value was insane. Cameras zoomed across the massive stage, catching the bright lights reflecting off the gold-plated podium, where my father, Bishop Terence, stood looking like a king. Thousands of people were packed into the auditorium, and tens of thousands more were tuning in online. I watched from the safe house, feeling my stomach turn, as the opening choir started their high-energy performance. Everything about this display was designed to project absolute power and holy perfection. Then the camera panned to the side of the stage. My mother, Yvonne, walked out. She was dressed in a stunning designer dress that looked like it had been custom-made just for this broadcast. She took the microphone with a practiced poise that would have been impressive if I did not know exactly what kind of monster was hiding beneath that smile. The music faded into a somber tone. Yvonne began her sermon, and within 2 minutes she was already talking about the pain of a grieving mother. She used a lace handkerchief to dab at her eyes, which were perfectly dry. She looked straight into the camera lens, her expression shifting from sorrow to righteous anger. She started talking about the tragedy of broken families and the influence of evil spirits. I leaned in closer to the monitor. Yvonne knew how to play this crowd like a virtuoso. She told them about her poor, misguided daughter Nyla, who had recently suffered a mental breakdown after the passing of my dear, sweet Serena. She claimed I was currently trapped in a spiral of dark obsession and manic episodes. She said I had become a vessel for negativity and demons, and that my actions were a direct attack on the integrity of our holy household. The audience began to moan in sympathy, and some people in the front row started raising their hands in prayer. Yvonne increased the intensity of her voice. She claimed I was currently holding a beautiful, innocent child hostage in an undisclosed location against her will. She said the child had run away from home and I had snatched her up to use her as a pawn in a cruel extortion scheme. I watched the chat feed on the side of the screen explode with thousands of comments. People were calling me a monster, a kidnapper, and a devil. Within 10 minutes, my phone started blowing up with notifications. My private contact information had been leaked online. The text messages and social media tags were filled with disgusting abuse. Total strangers were sending me photos of graves and telling me I should die so I could finally be with Serena. The level of vitriol was staggering. They believed every word she said because she was the first lady of their church. She had painted me as the ultimate villain, and they were ready to burn me at the stake. Yvonne wiped a tear that actually started to fall this time, and she called for the congregation to pray for me to be delivered from my madness. She was effectively putting a target on my back for the entire world to see. I looked at the screen and felt a surge of cold fury. I knew she was lying, but she was using the church to hide behind. I kept watching, waiting for her to make one mistake. Suddenly, the camera zoomed in for a tight close-up on Yvonne's face as she leaned over the podium to share a final message of hope. The light caught her neck perfectly. My eyes locked onto the large diamond necklace hanging from her throat. The stones were unique with a deep blue tint and a very specific teardrop cut. I froze. I knew that piece of jewelry better than I knew my own name. It was the signature heirloom that my grandmother had passed down to me in her original will. Years ago, when I had asked about it, Yvonne told me with a straight face that she had been forced to sell it to fund an orphanage in Haiti. She said she had to sacrifice her own treasures for the sake of the church. I remembered her crying about the poverty and the children who needed help. I had felt so guilty for even asking about a necklace when I saw how much pain it caused her to let it go. My hands started moving across the keyboard faster than they ever had before. I accessed the database of the orphanage charity that Yvonne claimed she funded with the sale of the heirloom. It took me less than 30 seconds to bypass the weak firewalls. I pulled up the charity budget sheets and the public disclosure reports. There was absolutely no record of any such sale in the church financial logs. I dug deeper into the hidden bank accounts I had been tracking since the morning. I found a deposit of $200,000 into Yvonne's private account dated exactly 3 years ago. The memo on the transaction read, "Jewelry liquidation." She had lied to my face for years. She had stolen my grandmother's legacy and pocketed the money for her own vanity while pretending to be a saint. I sat back in my chair and realized the power of what I had just found. She was not just a liar and a manipulator. She was a common thief using the church to facilitate her greed. She thought she was untouchable because she had the congregation behind her. But every single bit of money she had moved and every lie she had told was now stored in my drive. She had just committed the greatest mistake of her life by trying to destroy me on national television. I was not just going to defend myself. I was going to take everything from her. The adrenaline from discovering my mother's massive financial theft was still pumping fiercely through my veins when the heavy steel door of the safe house violently rattled. This time, the pounding was not the polite knock of a building manager dropping off a package. It was hard, aggressive, and carried the distinct weight of assumed authority. The loud, heavy thuds echoed off the concrete walls of the small room, vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. Arya jumped up from the leather sofa. Her small hands dropped her stuffed bear to the floor, and she let out a high-pitched scream of pure terror. She ran to the far corner of the room and curled herself into a tight ball, covering her ears with her hands. My heart ached for the little girl who had already endured so much trauma in her short life. She thought the bad men had finally come to take her away. I rushed over to her and knelt down on the cold floor. I spoke in a very soft and steady voice, telling her to be brave and promising her that absolutely no one was going to take her away from me. I stood up and walked silently to the security monitor sitting on the metal desk. I tapped the screen to pull up the exterior camera feed. There were 4 people standing outside the safe house door. 2 of them were local police officers in full uniform, looking impatient and aggressive with their hands resting on their duty belts. Standing between them was a woman wearing a cheap gray suit and holding a thick metal clipboard. She had the cold, bureaucratic look of a child protective services agent who was simply there to follow orders and collect a paycheck. Standing slightly behind them in the shadows near a parked car was one of Preston's private security thugs, keeping an eye on the operation. Preston had actually done it. He had used his massive wealth and his deep political connections in the city to bribe a child welfare agent and fast-track a local police raid on a Sunday morning. He wanted to bypass the family courts entirely and snatch Arya by brute force, claiming she was in imminent physical danger. He knew he could not win a legal custody battle, so he was using the corrupt system he funded to steal her back before I could expose his crimes. I walked over to the heavy steel door and slid the thick metal chain lock firmly into place. I turned the deadbolt just enough to open the door a tiny crack while keeping it completely secured to the frame. The cold morning air rushed through the narrow opening. The woman in the gray suit immediately stepped forward and shoved her metal clipboard right up against the crack in the door. She spoke in a loud, demanding voice, telling me she was an investigator with the Department of Child and Family Services. She said they had received an urgent anonymous tip that a severely mentally ill woman was holding a runaway child hostage in an unsafe, abandoned industrial building. She demanded that I open the door immediately and surrender the little girl to state custody so she could be placed in a safe foster home while I was taken in for a psychiatric evaluation. I looked right through the crack and told her she was completely out of her jurisdiction. I told her I had emergency physical custody granted by a judge and that she was acting on a fraudulent tip submitted by a man who was currently under active federal investigation. The CPS worker scoffed loudly. She told me my claims were the exact kind of paranoid delusions described in the anonymous report. She pulled a single piece of paper from her clipboard and held it up to the crack. It was a local emergency removal order. It looked incredibly rushed, and it was signed by a local magistrate known for attending my father's megachurch. Preston had literally bought a judge to sign a fake emergency order on a Sunday. The sheer corruption of it all was staggering, but I did not let my anger show. I told the CPS worker that her local order was completely invalid against a federal mandate, and that stepping foot inside this building would constitute a massive civil rights violation that would end her career in state government. One of the local police officers stepped forward, pushing the CPS worker slightly aside. He looked at me with pure disdain and told me I had exactly 10 seconds to unchain the door and step outside with my hands visible. He warned me that if I did not comply, they were going to use a battering ram to breach the steel door and arrest me for child endangerment and resisting a lawful order. Behind me, I could hear Arya crying softly in the dark corner of the room. The sound of her quiet sobs broke my heart, but it also fueled my absolute resolve. I looked the aggressive police officer dead in the eye and told him he was making a terrible mistake. I told him he was acting as a private mercenary for a corrupt billionaire, and that breaching this door would end his pension permanently. The officer sneered and told his partner to get the breaching ram from the cruiser. The heavy metal tool was brought up to the concrete steps. The cops took their positions, holding the heavy ram between them, preparing to smash the lock to pieces. The CPS worker stood back with a smug, satisfied look on her face, fully believing they were about to drag me out in handcuffs and hand my niece over to Preston's waiting thugs. I did not flinch, and I did not close the door. I just stood there watching the monitor out of the corner of my eye. I knew exactly what time it was. I had made a highly encrypted phone call hours ago, right after discovering the truth on the USB drive. I had sent a secure data packet containing Preston's money laundering files directly to my unit chief at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Just as the local officers pulled the heavy ram back to strike the door, the sound of screeching tires completely shattered the quiet morning. 3 massive black sport utility vehicles sped into the industrial park, kicking up clouds of dust and gravel. They swerved violently and boxed in the local police cruisers, blocking any possible exit. The doors of the black vehicles flew open simultaneously. 8 heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical vests stepped out, forming a solid wall around the safe house entrance. They carried federal authority and a presence that made the local cops freeze completely in their tracks. A tall woman wearing a sharp black suit stepped out of the lead vehicle. She was a federal prosecutor, and she was one of my closest allies in the Justice Department. She walked right up the concrete steps, holding a thick manila folder. She looked at the local police officers who were still awkwardly holding their battering ram. She told them to drop the equipment and step away from the door immediately. The local cops looked confused, and tried to argue, citing their local removal order. The federal prosecutor did not even let them finish their sentence. She opened her manila folder and pulled out a document bearing the official seal of a United States federal judge. She read the order out loud in a voice that demanded absolute obedience. She declared that the minor child Arya was officially classified as a protected material witness in an ongoing federal criminal probe involving massive financial fraud and international money laundering. She stated clearly that the child was to remain in the protective custody of senior forensic auditor Nyla effectively immediately. She turned her sharp gaze to the CPS worker and told her that any further attempt to remove the child would be prosecuted as a direct obstruction of a federal investigation. The local cops dropped the breaching ram to the concrete floor with a loud clang. The arrogant CPS worker turned completely pale. Her smug expression vanished instantly as she realized she had been manipulated into interfering with a massive federal case. She lowered her clipboard and began backing away, apologizing profusely to the prosecutor and claiming she was just following a tip. Preston had tried to use his local power to crush me, but his dirty money was absolutely useless against the full weight of the federal government. His plan had completely failed. The local cops retreated to their cars in total humiliation and drove away quickly. The federal prosecutor looked at me through the crack in the door and gave me a small, reassuring nod. I closed the door, slid the deadbolt shut, and walked back to the corner of the room. I reached out and pulled Arya into a tight, safe embrace, knowing that the real war was finally about to begin. The heavy steel door closed, and the safe house was quiet again. I had won the morning battle, but the war was far from over. Preston was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are always the most dangerous. Less than 2 hours after his corrupt police raid fell apart, my burner phone vibrated on the metal desk. I answered it and heard his cold voice on the other end. The fake Southern gentleman routine. The grieving widower act, it was all completely gone. He told me to meet him at a rundown diner on the edge of the city limits at midnight. He said, "Come alone, and let us settle this like adults." I knew exactly what he was trying to do. He realized his money could not buy the federal government, so he was going to try and buy me instead. I told my federal prosecutor friend to keep a very close watch on Arya, and I headed out into the dark night. The diner was an old, decaying building sitting alone on a desolate stretch of highway. The neon sign outside was flickering, and the parking lot was completely empty, except for Preston's massive luxury SUV idling in the shadows. I parked my rental car a few spaces away and walked inside. The air smelled like stale grease and old coffee. There was only one waitress wiping down the counter, and she did not even look up when I walked in. Preston was sitting in a dim booth at the very back of the restaurant. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that looked entirely ridiculous in a place with sticky vinyl seats and cracked linoleum floors. I walked over and slid into the booth across from him. I did not say a word. I just looked right into his cold blue eyes, waiting for him to make his move. Preston did not waste any time. He leaned back against the red vinyl seat and stared at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. He told me I was becoming a massive thorn in his side. He said he honestly could not understand why I was fighting so hard for a child that did not even belong to me. His voice was dripping with absolute arrogance as he listed all the ways he was superior to me and my family. He called my parents pathetic, greedy fools who practically sold my sister to him for a taste of real elite wealth. He laughed about how easy it was to manipulate the powerful bishop and the glamorous first lady with a few offshore bank transfers. Then he leaned forward and looked at me like I was something he had scraped off the bottom of his expensive Italian leather shoes. He said you were always the ugly, bitter sister, Nyla. He told me I spent my entire life living in Serena's shadow because I was too dark and too quiet for my parents to ever love properly. He said I was just using her bastard child to finally get some attention from the church community that had always rejected me. I listened to his vicious insults without showing a single shred of emotion on my face. My silence only seemed to irritate him more. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. He uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and quickly scribbled a series of numbers across the paper. He ripped the check from the book and slid it slowly across the sticky table, stopping right in front of me. I looked down at the paper. It was a cashier check made out to me for $2 million. Preston leaned in close and told me to take the money and disappear forever. He said it was more money than a low-level corporate dropout like me would ever see in a lifetime. He told me to hand over the kid and the USB drive tonight, and I could go buy myself a new face and a new life far away from his city. He fully expected me to be insulted. He thought I would scream at him or tear the check into pieces and throw it in his face. He thought my pride would overrule my logic because he fundamentally misunderstood who I was. In his world, everyone had a price and everyone was driven by petty emotions. But I was not a vulnerable, grieving sister sitting across from him. I was a senior forensic auditor actively building a federal case against a massive criminal enterprise. Tearing up a check was something they did in cheap movies to make a dramatic point. In the real world, holding on to that check meant holding on to concrete physical evidence. I picked up the piece of paper and carefully examined his signature. The ink was still slightly wet. I folded the check neatly in half and slid it into the pocket of my jacket. Preston let out a harsh laugh, thinking he had just successfully bought my silence. He started to slide out of the booth, telling me he would send his men to the safe house to collect the girl within the hour. I held up my hand and stopped him in his tracks. I looked him dead in the eye and told him $2 million was absolute pocket change for a man who had been laundering tens of millions through a megachurch for the past 4 years. I told him my price was not $2 million. My price was $5 million. His smug smile faltered for a second as my words registered. I told him I wanted the remaining $3 million completely untraceable, and I did not want it handed to me in a dark, greasy diner in the middle of the night. I leaned across the sticky table and laid out my exact terms. I told him this weekend my parents were hosting the massive legacy gala to honor Serena's memory at the downtown Ritz-Carlton. The entire city elite would be there. I told him I wanted him to hand me the money directly on that stage in front of every single donor and politician in the room. I said if he publicly presented the money to me, I would hand over the little girl and the USB drive that contained the video of Serena exposing his entire criminal network. I told him he could spin it any way he wanted. He could tell the crowd it was a generous donation to help his mentally ill sister-in-law. I did not care about his cover story. I only cared about getting exactly what I asked for in plain sight. Preston stared at me for a long time, trying to figure out my angle. His massive ego absolutely blinded him to the reality of the situation. He thought I was just another greedy member of my family desperately trying to cash in on my sister's tragedy. He thought my demand to be paid publicly was just a pathetic cry for validation from the elite society that had always treated me like an outcast. He scoffed loudly and shook his head. He told me I was just as disgusting and money-hungry as my parents. He said we were all exactly the same underneath it all. He agreed to my terms without a second thought. He told me to bring the kid and the drive to the gala, and he would make sure I got my blood money. Preston stood up, straightened his expensive tie, and walked out of the diner without looking back. I sat in the dim booth, listening to the roar of his SUV engine as he sped away into the dark night. A small, genuine smile spread across my face. I reached into my pocket and touched the folded $2 million check. Preston thought he had just bought his freedom from a bitter dropout. He was completely unaware that he had just handed physical written evidence of bribery directly to an undercover federal investigator. Bribing a federal witness with $2 million in a criminal investigation carried a mandatory federal prison sentence. I took a sip of my cold water. The trap was perfectly set and the bait was taken. Now all I had to do was show up to the gala and watch his entire corrupt empire burn to the ground. I stepped out of the diner and the freezing night air hit my face immediately. The buzzing neon sign above the door cast a harsh red glow across the cracked asphalt of the empty parking lot. I wrapped my coat tighter around my shoulders and walked toward my rental car, listening to the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. My mind was already racing ahead to the gala and the trap I had just set for Preston. I was calculating every single logistical detail for the federal raid. But before I could even reach for my car keys, two tall figures stepped out from the deep shadows of the building, entirely blocking my path. My heart spiked for a fraction of a second before my eyes adjusted to the dark. It was my parents. Bishop Terence and First Lady Yvonne stood there waiting in the freezing cold. They must have been sitting in their luxury sedan, watching Preston's vehicle leave. They were here to finish the job their wealthy son-in-law had started. My mother stepped forward first. She was wearing a heavy designer cashmere coat tightly belted at the waist, looking every bit the elite matriarch even in a dirty diner parking lot. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. Her voice trembled with a mixture of absolute disgust and rage. She told me I was a greedy, vile little monster. She said Preston had just called my father from his car and told them everything about my demand for $5 million. She scoffed and called me a cheap extortionist. She said I was actively trying to ruin a good, honorable man who had done nothing but support our family through a devastating tragedy. I just stared at her, letting her hurl her poisonous words into the cold air. I asked her if she really believed Preston was a good man, or if she was just terrified of losing the massive illegal donations he funneled into her private bank accounts. That completely set her off. Yvonne lost the last shred of her perfect church lady composure. She stepped right up into my personal space, her face contorted with years of repressed hatred. She told me I had always been a bitter, jealous parasite sucking the joy out of our family. She said I could not stand the fact that Serena was the beautiful, successful one, while I was nothing but a massive disappointment. I did not raise my voice, but I asked her why she made sure I felt like a disappointment every single day of my life. I asked her why she always pushed me into the background and treated me like a dirty secret. Yvonne let out a cold, cruel laugh that made my stomach turn. She told me to look in the mirror. She said, "Look at your skin, Nyla. You were always too dark and too plain." She admitted right there in the empty parking lot that my dark skin did not fit the glamorous, elite image she had carefully constructed for our mega church. She said Serena was light and radiant, and she was the perfect poster child for a blessed, wealthy family. She told me my deep complexion reminded the wealthy donors of the ghetto they were all trying to pretend they never came from. She said she had to break my confidence and make me the permanent scapegoat so Serena could shine brightly without any competition. She admitted she deliberately tore down my self-esteem piece by piece from the time I was a little girl, so I would never dare to step into the spotlight and embarrass her. Hearing my own mother admit that she mentally and emotionally abused me for 3 decades just because of the tone of my skin was a profound kind of violence. It was the ugly, toxic reality of colorism staring me right in the face from the woman who gave birth to me. She had sacrificed my entire childhood on the altar of her own vanity and her deep internalized self-hatred. My father stood right behind her, nodding along in silent agreement. He was the holy bishop who preached about God's unconditional love every single Sunday to thousands of people. But he looked at his own dark-skinned daughter with nothing but pure contempt. I felt a hot tear prick the corner of my eye, but I adamantly refused to let it fall. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me bleed. I took a deep breath and told her that her ugly truth meant absolutely nothing to me anymore, because her precious light-skinned golden child was dead, and her wealthy white savior was going to federal prison. My father stepped past my mother. His massive frame cast a dark shadow over me. He reached into his expensive tailored overcoat and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slapped it hard against the hood of my rental car. He told me I was not going anywhere near Preston or the Legacy Gala this weekend. He said he had spent the last few hours making some very private calls to the chief medical officer of the church hospital network. He pulled a sheet of paper halfway out of the envelope so I could see the official medical letterhead and the signature at the bottom. He told me it was a signed involuntary psychiatric hold. He said his highly paid doctor had officially certified, without even examining me, that I was an active danger to myself and others suffering from severe paranoid schizophrenia and violent delusions. He told me that all he had to do was make one single phone call, and an ambulance accompanied by armed private guards would show up at my safe house to drag me away in restraints. He said they would lock me in a padded room and pump me full of heavy antipsychotic sedatives until I forgot my own name. He smiled an evil, sinister smile and said absolutely nobody would ever question a grieving, loving father trying to get emergency medical help for his crazy, erratic daughter. Terrence leaned down until his face was inches from mine, his breath clouded in the freezing night air. He delivered his final, heavy ultimatum. He said, if you even think about showing your face at the gala, I will release this forged psychiatric hold immediately. He told me to take the $2 million check Preston offered, leave the state tonight and abandon the child at a local fire station, or he would personally ensure I spent the rest of my miserable life trapped in a mental asylum. He really thought he had completely checkmated me. He thought his raw power and absolute cruelty would finally force me to break and submit to his will. I looked down at the forged medical document, and then I looked up into my father's cold, empty eyes. I did not scream, I did not beg for mercy, and I certainly did not panic. My division at the Federal Bureau of Investigation handled corrupt medical professionals and false imprisonment charges every single day. His fake document was not a threat. It was just another massive federal crime to add to his growing indictment. I reached into my pocket, grabbed my car keys, and pressed the unlock button. The headlights flashed brightly, cutting right through the dark parking lot and illuminating their angry faces. I gave my parents a slow, chilling smile. I looked right at him and said, "See you on the red carpet, Bishop." I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and drove away, leaving them standing completely stunned in the freezing darkness. The drive back to the safe house was quiet, but my mind was moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour. The freezing rain had started to fall, slicking the empty city streets with a dangerous layer of black ice. As I gripped the steering wheel, I played the conversation from the diner over and over in my head. Preston had agreed to my demand for a public exchange at the Legacy Gala entirely too easily. Men like him do not suddenly play by the rules, and they certainly do not hand over $5 million in front of a live audience without a backup plan. He was a cornered criminal, and he was desperate to destroy the evidence before the sun came up. He wanted me to believe I had won the negotiation, so I would let my guard down, but I knew better. I knew he would send his worst monsters into the dark to finish the job tonight. I arrived at the industrial park and parked my rental car 2 blocks away, walking the rest of the distance in the freezing shadows. My federal prosecutor friend had already moved Arya to a highly classified secondary location hours ago. The little girl was completely safe, sleeping under the watchful eyes of armed federal marshals. The safe house was now completely empty, except for me and the trap I had carefully laid out. I was not just an accountant who sat behind a desk crunching numbers. My work with federal law enforcement meant I had deep connections with elite tactical units. I had used those connections to bring in a private security detail composed of former military operatives who specialized in neutralizing high-threat targets. I unlocked the heavy steel door and stepped into the pitch-black room. 4 heavily armed men dressed in dark tactical gear emerged from the shadows to greet me. The team leader gave me a silent nod, confirming that the perimeter was secure and the traps were set. I walked over to the reinforced back room and sat down in front of a bank of encrypted security monitors. All we had to do now was wait in the suffocating silence of the night. At exactly 3 in the morning, the silent alarms on my laptop flashed a bright blood red. The exterior cameras showed 3 large black SUVs rolling into the industrial park with their headlights completely turned off. They parked in a blind spot behind a crumbling brick wall. 5 massive men stepped out of the vehicles. They were wearing heavy body armor, black ski masks, and carrying suppressed automatic weapons. These were not just local street thugs. These were highly paid professional mercenaries, hired by a billionaire who was absolutely terrified of going to federal prison. Preston had sent a literal death squad to my door to retrieve a child and a USB drive, and he fully expected them to leave my dead body behind on the concrete floor. I watched the monitors with a cold, calculated focus. The mercenaries moved with absolute precision, stacking up against the heavy steel door of the safe house. They did not bother trying to pick the heavy deadbolt. The lead mercenary pulled out a high-temperature cutting torch. A blinding blue and white spark ignited in the darkness, and he began slicing straight through the heavy steel hinges. The smell of melting metal and ozone seeped into the building. I tapped my radio and gave the command to my security team to hold their positions and let the intruders breach the first room. I wanted them completely inside the kill box before we shut the door behind them. With a violent kick, the heavy steel door crashed inward, hitting the concrete floor with a deafening thud. The mercenaries flooded into the dark safe house, moving methodically with their weapons raised and their laser sights cutting through the pitch-black air. They swept the main living area, kicking over the leather sofa and tearing through the kitchen cabinets. The leader signaled for 2 of his men to secure the perimeter, while he and another man advanced toward the reinforced back room where I was sitting. They thought they had the element of absolute surprise. They thought they were hunting a terrified civilian. The moment the leader stepped past the threshold of the main hallway, the trap violently slammed shut. I hit a button on my console that instantly dropped heavy steel shutters over all the windows and locked the main entrance with an electronic deadbolt. The safe house was instantly plunged into absolute impenetrable darkness. Before the mercenaries could even reach for their night vision goggles, the room erupted in blinding, strobing tactical lights. My security detail moved like ghosts in the flashing chaos. It was a high-stakes physical confrontation, but it was over almost as quickly as it began. My men did not use lethal force because a dead mercenary cannot testify in a federal court. Instead, they used non-lethal tactical precision. The loud crack of a taser echoed through the hall, followed by the heavy thud of a massive man hitting the concrete floor, convulsing. One of the mercenaries tried to swing his suppressed rifle, but a member of my team grabbed the barrel, twisted it upward, and delivered a brutal strike to the back of the mercenary's knee, bringing him down instantly. I watched through this reinforced glass as the highly paid assassins were systematically dismantled and subdued. The sounds of heavy grunts shattering glass and the zip of thick plastic ties filled the air. Within 60 seconds, all 5 of Preston's elite mercenaries were face down on the ground, securely bound and completely neutralized. They were groaning in pain, their weapons stripped away and tossed into a pile in the corner. I stepped out of the back room and walked calmly into the strobe-lit hallway. The leader of the strike team was lying on his stomach, breathing heavily, as one of my men kept a heavy boot pressed firmly between his shoulder blades. I knelt down next to him, my face completely devoid of any emotion. I reached my hand into the front pocket of his tactical vest and pulled out a small black burner phone. He glared at me through the eye holes of his ski mask, realizing exactly how badly he had underestimated his target. I stood up and looked at the glowing screen of the burner phone. There was only one contact saved in the device. It was listed simply as the boss. I opened the messaging app and my thumbs flew across the small digital keyboard. I typed a very short, simple message. Job done, got the USB. I hit send and watched the little icon spin until it confirmed the message was delivered. I stood in the quiet safe house surrounded by bound mercenaries and waited. Less than 10 seconds later, the phone buzzed in my hand. It was a reply from Preston. The message read, "Burn the building and meet me at the drop point. Excellent work." I let out a low, dark laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. Preston was sitting in his luxury mansion, popping champagne and celebrating his victory. He truly believed he had just successfully ordered my execution and secured his criminal empire. He believed he was untouchable and that tomorrow at the Legacy Gala, he would be the undisputed king of the city. I slipped the burner phone into my pocket and looked at my security team. The evidence of attempted murder was now officially secured. The gala was only hours away, and Preston had absolutely no idea that he was about to walk blindly into a public slaughter. The morning of the Legacy Gala arrived with a bitter chill in the air. But inside the classified federal facility, the temperature felt perfectly controlled. I had relocated to the regional field office of the FBI before the sun even started to rise, leaving Arya safely secured with my federal prosecutor friend. The next 12 hours were the most critical window of my entire investigation. I sat alone in a highly secure conference room completely surrounded by glowing monitors and stacked boxes of subpoenaed financial records. This was my actual world. My family always treated me like a lowly corporate dropout because I did not wear flashy designer labels or seek out the spotlight. But sitting in the blue light of those screens, I was an absolute apex predator. I pulled up the final set of encrypted bank statements tracing the complicated web of offshore shell companies Preston had created. He was incredibly arrogant, but he was not nearly as smart as he believed himself to be. He had set up a fake charitable trust registered in the Cayman Islands, pretending it was an international missionary fund for my parents' megachurch. Every Sunday, thousands of honest, hard-working people placed their hard-earned money into the church collection plates, believing they were doing the work of the Lord. My parents funneled those millions directly into Preston's shell companies. Preston would then wash the money through high-end real estate developments and kick a massive percentage back to my parents in the form of luxury vehicles, private jets, and designer jewelry. It was a beautifully sinister operation until I tore it completely apart. My fingers flew across the keyboard, linking every single fraudulent wire transfer directly back to Preston's personal accounts. I cross-referenced the dates of the massive cash deposits with the days my mother claimed she was donating her personal wealth to orphans. Every single lie she had ever told on that pulpit was systematically dismantled by the cold, hard mathematical truth staring back at me on the screen. I compiled the final financial audit, creating an airtight federal indictment package that would put Preston and my parents behind bars for the rest of their natural lives. I hit print on the massive document and listened to the heavy federal printers churn out the physical evidence of their total destruction. Just as the printer finished its work, there was a sharp knock at the conference room door. A senior agent walked in holding a thick manila envelope stamped with the official seal of the Federal Family Court. He handed it to me with a respectful nod and stepped back out of the room. I knew exactly what was inside. I carefully broke the red wax seal and slid the heavy parchment paper out onto the desk. It was the expedited court-ordered DNA test results. The forensic lab had worked through the night comparing Arya's DNA with the medical samples taken during Serena's autopsy. I read down the lines of complex genetic markers until I reached the final conclusion at the bottom of the page. The probability of maternity was 99.9%. Arya was officially and legally proven to be Serena's biological daughter. Staring at that piece of paper, a fresh wave of deep, profound anger washed over me. My parents had completely erased this beautiful little girl's existence just to protect a multi-million-dollar money laundering operation masked as a holy marriage. They had forced my sister to live in a state of absolute psychological torment while they smiled and collected tithes from their massive congregation. I carefully folded the DNA results and placed them directly on top of the financial audit. The two documents together were the ultimate weapons I needed to execute my trap. I packed the physical files into my leather briefcase and locked it securely. I checked my watch. There were only 4 hours left until the doors of the Ritz-Carlton opened for the Legacy Gala. I left the federal building and drove back to the safe house where Arya was waiting. It was time to prepare for the final confrontation. I had spent my entire life shrinking myself to make my mother and sister feel comfortable. I had allowed my mother to constantly tear down my self-esteem, telling me my dark skin was too harsh and my features were too plain for high society. She always made sure I wore muted colors and stayed quietly in the background, so I would never outshine her golden child. Tonight, I was going to completely shatter every single insecurity she had ever forced upon me. I walked into the bedroom where my clothes were waiting and unzipped the heavy black garment bag. I pulled out a breathtaking custom designer gown. It was a brilliant, deep, emerald green silk that hugged every single curve of my body and contrasted beautifully against the rich, dark tone of my skin. It was the kind of dress that demanded absolute attention the moment you walked into a room. I slipped into the gown and stepped into a pair of sleek black designer heels. I applied my makeup with sharp precision, highlighting the striking bone structure I shared with my ancestors. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, elegant style that left my face completely open and unapologetic. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at me was not the quiet, bitter outcast my family believed her to be. She was a senior federal investigator, a fierce protector, and a woman who fully understood the incredible power of her own worth. I grabbed my leather briefcase and walked out into the living room. Arya was sitting on the sofa wearing a beautiful little black velvet dress I had bought for her the day before. She looked exactly like a tiny, beautiful version of Serena. She looked up at me with those big brown eyes and gave me a small, shy smile. I knelt down in front of her and gently adjusted the small bow in her hair. I told her that tonight we were going to go to a very big party and that she needed to be very brave for just a little while longer. She nodded slowly and reached out her small hand. I wrapped my fingers around hers, feeling the immense weight of the responsibility I carried. I was not just fighting for my own vindication anymore. I was fighting to give this little girl the beautiful free life that my parents and Preston had violently stolen from her mother. I stood up tall, gripping the heavy leather briefcase in one hand and holding Arya's hand firmly in the other. My trap was perfectly set, and the bait was waiting on a silver platter. I took a deep, steadying breath and walked out the door into the cool evening air. It was time for war. The heavy tires of my rental car pulled up to the grand entrance of the downtown Ritz-Carlton. The valet stepped forward immediately, opening my door as the flash of paparazzi cameras instantly lit up the cool night air. The Legacy Gala was not just a memorial service, it was the most anticipated high society event of the entire year. Hundreds of the most powerful Black elites, politicians, wealthy donors, and mega church leaders were flowing through the gilded double doors. They were all dressed in custom tuxedos and floor-length designer gowns, ready to celebrate the tragic, beautiful memory of my sister Serena. The sheer scale of the opulence was sickening. Every crystal chandelier, every ice sculpture, and every expensive bottle of champagne was paid for with stolen money, washed through my parents' corrupt empire. I handed the valet my keys and stepped onto the plush red carpet. The freezing wind bit at my skin, but I did not shiver. I reached back into the car and gently helped Arya step out onto the pavement. She looked up at the towering luxury hotel with wide, terrified eyes. I squeezed her small hand firmly and whispered that she was the most important person in this entire building and that she had absolutely nothing to fear. We walked through those massive glass doors and entered the grand ballroom. The space was absolutely breathtaking, filled with thousands of white roses and the soft, elegant sounds of a live string quartet. But the moment I stepped past the velvet ropes, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. The polite chatter of the wealthy attendees began to die down, spreading like a silent shockwave from the entrance all the way to the front of the room. Heads turned, and hundreds of judgmental eyes locked onto me. These were the exact same people who had watched my mother's tearful Sunday broadcast. These were the people who had flooded my phone with death threats, believing I was a mentally unstable kidnapper possessed by demons. They expected to see a broken, deranged woman dragging a terrified street child. Instead, they saw me standing tall in a breathtaking deep emerald green silk gown that radiated pure, undeniable power. The dress moved like liquid glass under the crystal chandeliers, and my posture was completely unbothered. I held my heavy leather briefcase in my right hand and Arya's small hand in my left. The crowd parted for us instantly, stepping back as if we were royalty walking through the center of a conquered kingdom. I did not have to look far to find my mother. First Lady Yvonne was holding court near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a group of wealthy politicians' wives. She was wearing a blindingly expensive silver gown and laughing at a joke when her eyes suddenly caught the movement in the crowd. She looked up and saw me walking directly toward the center aisle. All the blood completely drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her forced high society smile instantly shattered. She excused herself from the wealthy wives, and Power walked toward me, moving fast enough to intercept me before I could reach the front of the room. She stopped dead in my path, using her body to physically block my access to the main floor. She looked down at Arya with a flash of pure panic and then glared up at me with absolute venom. Her chest was heaving, but she kept her voice pinned down to a vicious whisper so the staring crowd could not hear her rage. She asked me what the hell I thought I was doing walking through the front door like I belonged here. She leaned in close so I could smell the expensive champagne on her breath. She told me Preston was waiting to finalize our little arrangement, but he was not going to do it in front of the entire city. She hissed at me to take your checkout back and get out of here. She told me I was embarrassing the family and that I needed to take my blood money and get out of her sight forever before she had me arrested for trespassing. She was absolutely desperate, trying to maintain the fragile illusion of control. She honestly thought the psychiatric hold my father forged was keeping me terrified. She thought I had dressed up just to make a pathetic final statement before disappearing with the hush money. She had absolutely no idea that the briefcase in my hand did not contain any room for a check. It contained the federal warrants that were about to end her entire glamorous life. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or try to explain myself. I just looked at the woman who had spent 30 years tearing down my self-esteem because my skin was too dark. I looked at the thief who had stolen my grandmother's legacy to buy a diamond necklace, and I felt absolutely nothing for her. No anger, no fear, no sadness, just pure cold indifference. I gave her a slow, chilling smile that made her take a sudden step backward. I told her to get out of my way, Yvonne. I did not call her mother. I just used her first name, dropping the heavy weight of it right onto the polished marble floor between us. Before she could even process the disrespect, I stepped effortlessly around her and continued walking straight down the center aisle. She let out a sharp gasp, reaching out to grab my arm, but she caught herself just in time, remembering the hundreds of elite eyes watching her every move. She was completely paralyzed by her own obsession with public perception. I kept my eyes locked dead ahead, walking with a steady, rhythmic pace toward the front of the ballroom. The VIP head table sat on a slightly elevated stage completely covered in white lilies and glowing candles. Right in the center seat, acting like the king of the entire gala, sat Preston. He was wearing a sharp custom tuxedo and swirling a glass of amber liquor. He saw me approaching, and a highly arrogant smirk spread slowly across his face. He thought my grand entrance was just a bitter woman trying to soak up a few seconds of attention before taking a payoff. He thought he had won the war. As I drew closer, I watched Preston casually raise his hand and snap his fingers. 3 massive security guards wearing dark suits and earpieces instantly stepped out from behind the velvet curtains. Preston nodded his head toward me, signaling his thugs to prepare to drag me out by my hair the exact second the transaction was finished. He was ready for a show, and I was more than happy to give him one. I kept walking until I reached the very front row, stopping just a few feet away from the elevated stage where Preston sat, looking like a smug king holding court over his wealthy subjects. The live string quartet abruptly stopped playing their instruments. The heavy velvet curtains behind the head table parted, and the massive crystal chandeliers dimmed down to a soft glow, leaving only a blinding white spotlight shining directly on the wooden podium. Preston stood up slowly, buttoning his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket, and walked to the microphone. He looked out over the vast sea of elite faces and bowed his head, taking a long, deep breath that echoed loudly through the massive sound system. He began to speak, and his voice was the absolute perfect mixture of practiced grief and stoic strength. He talked about Serena, describing her as a radiant angel who was taken from this world far too soon by a tragic accident. He wiped a non-existent tear from his cheek and told the crowd how much he missed her bright smile every single morning. He spoke about the deep void she left in his heart and in the massive congregation of the Kingdom Harvest megachurch. The wealthy politicians and church elders in the audience were eating it up, completely hanging on to his every single word and murmuring their deep sympathies. My father, Bishop Terence, sat at the edge of the stage, nodding his head with a look of profound, fake sorrow. Then Preston looked down right at me. His cold blue eyes locked onto mine, and that arrogant smirk flickered across his face for just a fraction of a second before he quickly replaced it with a look of profound pity. He leaned closer into the microphone, and his voice echoed across the dead silent ballroom. He said, "Tonight, we are here to honor Serena, but we are also here to heal as a family." He gestured toward me with an open hand, playing the role of the benevolent, gracious savior. He asked the crowd to please look upon his sister-in-law, Nyla. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and told the 1,000 people in the room that the tragic, sudden loss of Serena had completely broken my mind. He claimed I was currently suffering from severe paranoid delusions and that the intense grief had driven me to do desperate, irrational things that were hurting the people who loved me the most. The room shifted uncomfortably. People began to whisper, pointing their expensive champagne glasses in my direction. Preston motioned for me to step up onto the stage. He told the crowd that despite my erratic behavior and my highly disturbing mental state, he was a man of God and a man of infinite forgiveness. He looked at Arya, who was standing beside me, gripping my hand tightly, and he shook his head with fake sadness. He announced to the room that I had taken in a homeless street orphan in a misguided, desperate attempt to replace the sister I lost. He said he would not let his family suffer any longer in the shadows. He promised the entire congregation that he would personally fund this poor orphan's care in a state-of-the-art group home, so that I could finally be committed to a psychiatric facility to get the serious medical help I desperately needed. A collective gasp of sympathy and shock rippled through the massive ballroom. My mother Yvonne was nodding in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing her part perfectly. They were trying to publicly humiliate me into submission, wrapping their poison in a layer of holy charity. Preston reached his hand out, urging me to come up the steps. I did not hesitate for a single second. I squeezed Arya's hand, and we walked up the short flight of stairs together, standing directly next to him under the blinding white spotlight. Preston pulled me into a tight, uncomfortable hug, pretending to comfort me for the flashing cameras of the local press. As he squeezed my shoulder, his hand slid down and he pressed a folded piece of heavy paper into my palm. He leaned his face right next to my ear, completely hidden from the audience, and dropped his fake, grieving voice entirely. He whispered the words with pure, unadulterated venom. He said, "You lose, drop out. Take the money. Leave the kid and get the hell out of my city before my men throw you in the river." He pulled back from the hug and gave me a warm, patronizing smile for the crowd, fully expecting me to turn around and walk away in total defeat. He expected me to lower my head and shuffle off the stage like the broken scapegoat my family had always trained me to be. He thought his $5 million was the ultimate display of absolute power. But I did not step down from the stage. I did not cower, and I certainly did not walk away. I looked down at the heavy folded paper in my hand. I opened it slowly, letting the bright stage lights illuminate the ink. It was a certified cashier check for exactly $5 million made out directly to me. He had actually done it. His massive ego had convinced him he was completely untouchable. He had handed me the physical evidence of his bribery in front of 1,000 witnesses. I looked at Preston and gave him a slow, chilling smile that made the arrogant confidence completely drain from his face in an instant. His blue eyes widened as he realized I was not leaving the stage. I reached out and snatched the microphone right out of the heavy brass stand. The sudden, violent movement caused a loud burst of static to echo through the massive speakers, making several wealthy donors in the front row jump in their seats. Preston reached for my arm, his face twisting in sudden panic, but he was too late. I stepped just out of his reach. I held the $5 million check up high above my head so the bright spotlight caught it perfectly for everyone to see. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice ringing out clear and steady across the massive room. I told the crowd that Preston had just handed me a $5 million bribe to walk away and keep my mouth shut. Before the gasp from the audience could even fully form, I placed my hands on either side of the heavy paper and ripped it straight down the middle. I tore it again and again until the $5 million check was nothing but tiny worthless pieces of confetti. I threw the shredded paper right into Preston's horrified face, letting the pieces flutter down onto the polished wooden floor between us. The entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. People were standing up, knocking over their chairs and dropping their expensive crystal glasses onto the marble floor. Preston stood there completely frozen, staring at the shredded paper at his feet, as if his brain could not process what had just happened. He had tried to humiliate me in front of the entire city, but he had just triggered the explosive trap that was going to bury him forever. The shreds of the $5 million check fluttered down around Preston's expensive leather shoes like dirty snow. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of what I had just done. He had spent his entire life buying people off and crushing anyone who dared to say no to him. The shredded paper lay on the ground as a testament to his failure. He had never experienced a public rejection, and his massive ego simply could not compute the reality of the moment. I did not give him a chance to recover. I stepped right past him and took the center position at the wooden podium. I gripped the edges of the podium and leaned into the microphone. My voice cut through the rising whispers of the shocked elite crowd like a sharp knife. I told them to sit down and listen very carefully because the memorial service they came to attend was actually a crime scene. The low murmurs in the grand ballroom instantly turned into a deafening roar of confusion. Wealthy politicians shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and church elders leaned forward, straining to hear what I was going to say next. Preston finally snapped out of his frozen state. His face turned a dark, violent shade of red. He lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone out of my hand, but one of my private security members who had infiltrated the catering staff stepped out of the shadows and firmly blocked his path. Preston glared at the guard, realizing for the very first time that he was not the only one in the room with muscle. I ignored his silent rage completely. I raised my left hand and gave a very small, subtle signal toward the audio-visual booth perched high above the back of the ballroom. Preston thought he controlled the hotel, but my federal tech team had already hacked into the secure network of the Ritz-Carlton 3 hours ago. The massive projection screens behind the head table had been playing a continuous looping slideshow of Serena's beautiful smiling face all night long. Suddenly, the soft memorial music was abruptly cut off. The giant screens flickered violently and then went completely black. The sudden darkness on the stage made the crowd gasp. A second later, a blinding white document was projected across all 3 massive screens spanning the entire back wall of the stage. The official seal of the United States Federal Family Court was completely unmistakable at the top of the page. I pointed up at the massive glowing screens, and my voice echoed powerfully across the silent room. I told the crowd to read the document carefully. I told them they were looking at a court-ordered genetic test that was expedited just this morning by a federal judge. I read the bold black text out loud, making sure my voice reached the very back row of the ballroom. The probability of maternity is 99.9%. I looked down at the 1,000 faces staring up at me, and I pointed to Arya, who was standing bravely by the edge of the stage. I announced with absolute clarity that this beautiful little girl was not a homeless street orphan that I had picked up to run an extortion scheme. I told them she was Arya, and she was Serena's biological daughter. A shockwave of pure disbelief ripped through the audience. Women covered their mouths in horror, and men loosened their silk ties. The atmosphere in the room grew thicker with every word I spoke. I did not stop talking. I turned my gaze directly to my parents who were sitting in the front row, looking like they had just seen a ghost. I told the congregation the ugly, sickening truth. I explained how their beloved Bishop Terence and their glamorous First Lady Yvonne had forced their own daughter to hide her pregnancy. I told the crowd how my parents had ripped a newborn baby right out of Serena's arms the day she was born and locked the child away in a secret facility funded by stolen church money. I made sure every single person in that room understood that my parents had erased their own flesh and blood just to protect their pristine elite image. Then I turned my full wrath toward Preston, who was currently hyperventilating near the podium. I called him exactly what he was. I told the crowd that my parents had hidden Serena's child, so they could sell her off to this wealthy white savior. I explained that their perfect holy marriage was nothing but a dirty financial transaction. My parents traded their beautiful daughter to a man who used our megachurch to wash his illegal offshore money. They sacrificed Serena's freedom and her happiness so they could afford their designer clothes and their luxury cars. I told the crowd they were not donating to a church every Sunday, they were funding a criminal syndicate run by a man who bought his way into a black family to hide his crimes behind a pulpit. The ballroom erupted into absolute total pandemonium. The illusion was completely shattered. Wealthy donors were standing up shouting questions and demanding answers. Politicians who had endorsed my father's church were actively backing away from the head table, trying to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal that was unfolding before their eyes. My mother Yvonne realized her entire empire was crumbling to dust in a matter of minutes. She had absolutely no arguments left, and no lies to hide behind. So she resorted to her ultimate weapon, theatrical victimhood. She clutched her chest with both hands, let out a loud, dramatic wail that echoed over the crowd, and collapsed backward into the arms of the women sitting next to her. She faked a massive fainting spell, hoping the medical emergency would stop my speech. I looked down at my mother lying on the marble floor, pretending to be unconscious, and I just shook my head in disgust. I spoke right into the microphone and told the crowd not to bother calling an ambulance because her performance was just as fake as her charity work. My father, Terence, lost his holy facade entirely. His face was contorted with absolute panic and pure rage. He jumped out of his seat and started screaming at the top of his lungs. He ordered the audio-visual technicians to cut the screens immediately. He yelled for someone to cut the microphone power and get me off the stage. He waved his arms frantically, signaling the hotel security to rush the stage and shut the entire gala down. But the technicians in the booth were not hotel staff. They were my federal agents, and they had barricaded the heavy steel door of the control room. The screens stayed bright, and my microphone remained completely live. Terence realized he could not stop the broadcast, so he turned to the crowd and yelled for everyone to evacuate the room. He told them the gala was over, and they needed to leave immediately. The panicked guests turned and rushed toward the grand brass doors at the back of the ballroom, wanting to escape the chaos. But as the first group of men grabbed the heavy brass handles and pulled, they quickly realized the terrifying truth. The doors did not budge. They were chained and locked firmly from the outside. Nobody was leaving this room until they heard every single word I had to say. The panic in the room reached a fever pitch as the wealthy guests yanked at the heavy brass doors, finding them completely locked from the outside. My father, Terence, was screaming at the security guards to break the chains, but nobody was moving. I stood at the podium and tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, echoing thud cut through the chaos. I told them to sit down. I said, "You all came here tonight to honor my sister, and you are not leaving until you hear her final words." The sheer authority in my voice made the panicked crowd freeze. Slowly, reluctantly, the elite members of the Kingdom Harvest Megachurch turned around and faced the stage. They were trapped inside a gilded cage, and the truth was about to hunt them down. I looked up at the AV booth and gave my federal tech team the final signal. The massive screens behind me faded from the bright white DNA document into complete blackness for a few heavy seconds. Then the audio crackled to life. The sound of a ragged, terrified breath echoed through the massive concert speakers, filling every single corner of the grand ballroom. The screens flickered, and Serena's face appeared towering 30 feet high over the silent crowd. The collective gasp that ripped through the room was deafening. This was not the glamorous, perfectly styled Serena they were used to seeing on the covers of church magazines. Her hair was a tangled mess. Her lip was busted, and a massive dark purple bruise covered the entire left side of her face. Her eyes were swollen, and she looked entirely broken. Serena looked directly into the camera lens with wide, terrified eyes. Her voice shook as she started to speak. She said, "My name is Serena. And if you are watching this, it means Preston finally killed me." The entire ballroom felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of it in a single second. Women in the front row clamped their hands over their mouths, holding back screams. I watched Preston out of the corner of my eye. His face went completely pale. He took a step back, stumbling over the microphone cord on the stage, shaking his head in absolute denial as his dead wife began to confess all of his sins to the entire world. He looked around frantically, searching for an escape, but my private security guards had silently moved to block every single exit path from the stage. Serena's voice cracked as she confessed the truth about her perfect marriage. She told the congregation that Preston had been physically abusing her for years. She detailed how he would smile for the church cameras on Sunday and then lock her in their bedroom and beat her on Monday. She described the nights she spent locked in closets, terrified for her life, while the congregation praised him as a pillar of the community. She cried as she explained that she begged our parents for help so many times. She said she went to Bishop Terence and First Lady Yvonne, showing them her bruises and pleading with them to let her come home. The crowd turned their disgusted eyes toward my parents. My father was completely frozen, staring at the screen in horror. My mother was still on the floor, but she had opened her eyes, realizing she could not fake her way out of this nightmare. Serena did not stop there. She leaned closer to the camera and explained exactly why our parents refused to save her. She told the thousands of donors sitting in the room that Preston was embezzling massive amounts of money from the church charity funds. She detailed the offshore shell companies, the fake missionary trips, and the luxury kickbacks that my parents happily accepted in exchange for keeping their mouths shut about the abuse. She listed the exact accounts and the exact amounts, proving everything I had just compiled in my federal audit. She said my parents sold my life to protect their wealth. The wealthy politicians and church elders who had funded my father's empire for decades began shouting in absolute outrage, realizing they had been massively scammed to fund a violent criminal's luxurious lifestyle. The holy image of the Kingdom Harvest megachurch was being completely obliterated frame by frame. Then Serena dropped the final devastating piece of the truth. The tears streamed down her bruised cheeks as she looked into the lens. She said, "I finally packed my bags tonight. I told Preston I was leaving him and taking Arya away to expose everything." She choked on a heavy sob and whispered that Preston had cornered her at the top of the grand staircase in their mansion. She said he told her that if she tried to walk out the front door, he would push her down the stairs and tell the police she tripped in her heels. She looked into the camera and delivered her final haunting message. She said, "If they tell you I fell, it is a lie. Preston murdered me to protect the money. Please, Nyla, avenge me." The video abruptly cut to black, leaving the ballroom in a state of stunned, horrifying silence. The truth was entirely undeniable. It was a confession from the grave, exposing a massive criminal conspiracy and a brutal, cold-blooded murder. The wealthy congregation was absolutely sickened. People were weeping openly, and others were glaring at Preston with pure, violent hatred. The men who had shaken his hand and praised his business acumen just an hour ago were now looking at him like he was a monster. Preston realized his entire world had just collapsed. His pristine reputation, his wealth, his freedom, it was all completely gone in a matter of minutes. His mind simply could not handle the sheer magnitude of his public destruction. Preston snapped completely. The calm, calculating, arrogant billionaire vanished, and a rabid, cornered animal took his place. His face turned a vibrant shade of purple, and the veins bulged violently in his neck. He lunged toward the podium, screaming like an absolute maniac. He did not even care who was watching anymore. His voice cracked with feral rage as he spit his words into the air. He screamed at the top of his lungs to shut it off right now. He beat his chest with his fists like a lunatic, ignoring the hundreds of phones that were now recording his complete mental breakdown. He yelled, "I own this church. I own this family. You are nothing but a broke loser." I stood completely still, letting his insane words wash over me. I did not flinch, and I did not back away. The man who had ordered my death just a few hours ago was now reduced to a screaming toddler throwing a temper tantrum in a very expensive suit. His true colors were finally bleeding out for the entire world to see. The illusion of the wealthy white savior was dead and buried. He was just a desperate criminal screaming at a woman he could no longer control. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes wide and completely crazed, repeating that he was the king of this city and nobody could touch him. I watched Preston screaming his lungs out and waving his arms like a completely rabid animal. The contrast between us was staggering. He was a billionaire throwing a violent public tantrum, and I was a woman standing perfectly still in a custom emerald gown, holding the microphone with absolute calm. The tension in the room was so thick it was suffocating. The elite crowd held their collective breath, waiting to see what I would do next. They expected me to shrink back or call for security. And then I did the one thing Preston absolutely did not expect. I laughed. It was not a forced or nervous sound. It was a deep, genuine laugh that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the massive ballroom. The sound of my laughter cut right through his crazed ranting like a sharp blade. Preston froze instantly, his mouth hanging open as he stared at me in total disbelief. He was so used to people cowering and begging when he raised his voice. He had absolutely no idea how to process a black woman laughing directly in the face of his unhinged fury. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at him. My voice was calm and completely steady as I spoke into the microphone. I told him to listen to himself. I asked him if he really still believed he was the untouchable king of the city. I reminded him of the specific insult he had whispered in my ear just moments ago, calling me a broke, dropout loser. I smiled a slow, dangerous smile and asked Preston if he had tried to buy a coffee this morning. I asked him if he wondered why his black titanium credit cards were suddenly declining all over town. His blue eyes widened and a sudden flash of profound realization hit his face. His chest started heaving as the panic finally breached his massive ego. I turned my gaze to the audience and told the entire room that I was not a failed corporate accountant. I announced with absolute authority that my name was Nyla, and I was the lead forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service and a covert financial investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The shock that rolled through the ballroom was physical. People actually gasped out loud, and several politicians physically stepped back away from the stage. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, there is absolutely nothing more terrifying than those 3 letters. I looked back at Preston and told him that while he was busy calling me ugly and bitter in that greasy diner last night, I was already deep inside his encrypted Cayman Island shell companies. I explained that every single dollar he had stolen from the church, every fake real estate transaction, and every dirty wire transfer was currently sitting in a massive organized file on the desk of the FBI director. I watched his knees actually buckle. Preston staggered backward, clutching the edge of the wooden podium to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. His breathing became shallow and rapid. The reality of his situation was finally crashing down on him with the weight of a freight train. He had spent years underestimating me because of the color of my skin and the quiet way I carried myself. He thought I was just a weak scapegoat he could easily intimidate or buy off with a few $1,000,000. I reminded him about the check I had just torn into shreds. I told him that handing me a $5 million bribe in front of 1,000 witnesses and a dozen hidden federal cameras was the absolute final nail in his coffin. I told him he was looking at life in a federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of parole. The wealthy politicians who had taken his campaign donations were now shouting at hotel security to let them out of the room, completely terrified that their names were also in my forensic audit. Preston looked around at the angry, disgusted faces of the people who used to worship his wealth. He had absolutely nothing left. His empire was completely vaporized. But I was not finished yet. The federal government was going to take care of Preston, but I had a very personal score to settle with the two people sitting in the front row. I turned my back on the broken billionaire and looked directly at my parents. Bishop Terence and First Lady Yvonne were huddled together, clutching each other in absolute terror. They knew the feds were going to seize the megachurch and all of their luxury assets tied to Preston's money laundering. But as I looked at my mother, I could see a tiny glimmer of defiant hope still hiding in her eyes. She thought she still had her ultimate safety net. She thought that even if the church fell, she still had access to the massive generational wealth. I walked right to the edge of the stage, looking down at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to destroy my spirit. I spoke directly to Yvonne, but I kept the microphone close so everyone in the room could hear her final humiliation. I asked her if she was currently calculating how quickly she could access Grandma's blind trust. When my grandmother passed away, she left behind an absolutely massive fortune wrapped in a highly secretive trust. My parents had spent years eagerly waiting for the legal restrictions to expire so they could get their hands on that money. They had completely disinherited me in their own minds, and because Serena was dead, they assumed the money would automatically default to their control as the surviving next of kin. I watched Yvonne's face twitch as I brought up the trust. She glared at me, still trying to hold on to her false superiority. I gave her a cold, unforgiving smile. I told her she really should have paid closer attention to the specific legal stipulations in Grandma's will. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, certified legal document, holding it up to the stage lights. I told my parents that Grandma's will explicitly stated that the $100 million blind trust was to be held securely until the birth of Serena's firstborn child. I looked over at Arya, who was watching me with wide, trusting eyes, and then I looked back at my parents. I told them that because the federal court had just legally proven Arya to be Serena's biological daughter, the entire $100 million estate instantly and irrevocably belonged to her. My father let out a choked, agonizing gasp, gripping his chest as if he was having a physical heart attack. My mother started shaking her head violently, refusing to accept the words coming out of my mouth. Her safety net was completely gone. I told them the absolute best part was that the federal courts had just officially appointed me as the sole permanent executor and legal guardian of Arya's entire estate. I told my parents they did not have access to a single penny of Grandma's money. The megachurch was being seized by the IRS for back taxes. Their luxury mansion was heavily mortgaged with dirty money and would be foreclosed by the end of the week. Their offshore accounts were completely frozen, and the charity funds were being drained to pay restitution. I looked into their horrified, desperate eyes, watching the exact moment their entire false reality shattered into pieces. I lowered my voice, speaking with a devastating clarity that echoed through the silence of the room. I told them they were completely and utterly bankrupt. The wail of police sirens pierced the tense, suffocating silence of the grand ballroom before anyone could even take another breath. The sound grew louder and more piercing by the second, echoing off the tall buildings downtown. Suddenly, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the high stained glass windows of the Ritz-Carlton, casting an eerie, strobing glow over the terrified faces of the elite guests. The heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom, which had been chained shut by my team, were violently pushed open from the outside. The heavy metal chains hit the marble floor with a deafening crash. Dozens of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers and heavy body armor stormed into the room. They moved with absolute military precision, shouting orders and securing all the exits. The wealthy politicians and mega-church elders screamed and scattered, pushing against each other in a blind panic, trying to get out of the way of the heavily armed agents. Preston realized his money and his privilege meant absolutely nothing in this room anymore. The pure terror on his face was something I will never forget. He scrambled off the stage, tearing through the beautiful white flower arrangements and violently knocking over a massive crystal ice sculpture. It shattered into thousands of pieces across the marble floor just like his fake empire. But he did not make it very far. 3 massive federal agents descended on him, tackling him hard to the polished floor. The sickening thud of his body hitting the ground was completely drowned out by his pathetic cries. The arrogant billionaire who thought he owned the entire city was thrashing and screaming for his high-priced lawyers. An agent drove a heavy knee into Preston's back, pulling his arms behind him and snapping a pair of thick steel handcuffs onto his wrists. They dragged him up to his feet. His custom-tailored tuxedo was torn, and he was bleeding from a cut on his forehead. He was completely stripped of his power and his dignity. The lead agent read him his federal rights loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, and they marched him out in front of all the people who used to worship his every move. My parents watched the raid unfold in absolute paralyzing horror. The FBI agents began moving toward the front row carrying thick manila folders filled with federal warrants bearing my father's name. Bishop Terrence and First Lady Yvonne realized there was absolutely no escape left. Their private jets were grounded by federal order, and their offshore accounts were permanently zeroed out. The holy image they had spent 30 years building was dead. They fell to their knees right there on the cold marble floor, surrounded by the wreckage of the gala. My father crawled toward the edge of the stage, tears streaming down his face, ruining his perfectly tailored suit. The great bishop was reduced to a crying, trembling mess. My mother reached her shaking hands up to me, sobbing hysterically and begging for mercy. Her expensive makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She cried out, telling me that they made a mistake. She begged me to please save the church and save their reputation from ruin. She screamed that we were family, and she pleaded with me, saying, "Please, Nyla, we are blood." I looked down at them, kneeling in the ruins of their own monumental greed. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sadness. The ice in my veins was completely solid, and my mind was crystal clear. I had spent my entire life starving for their affection and trying to earn a place in their hearts. But standing there looking at the monsters who sold their own daughter to a criminal, I realized they were never my family. I looked my mother dead in the eyes, and my voice was razor sharp. I told her blood does not sell a child for a zip code. I pointed to the federal agents who were now stepping up to place them in handcuffs, and I told them to tell it to the IRS. I turned my back on them, completely blocking out the pathetic sound of their desperate wailing. I stepped down from the stage and took Arya's small hand in mine. We walked calmly through the parting sea of federal agents and stunned elites. We walked out the front doors of the Ritz-Carlton into the cool night air, leaving the burning ashes of their empire far behind us forever. 6 months later, the morning sun felt incredibly warm and comforting against my skin. The freezing winter nights and the dark shadows of my past were finally a distant memory. Arya and I stood together on a quiet grassy hill overlooking the beautiful city skyline. A gentle breeze rustled the green leaves of the old oak tree, shading Serena's grave. We had brought a massive bouquet of fresh white lilies to replace the wilted flowers from our last visit. The graveyard was peaceful, and the air smelled like blooming jasmine and fresh rain. So much had changed in half a year. The federal government had moved with swift and brutal efficiency, completely dismantling the criminal network. The Kingdom Harvest megachurch was seized entirely by the Internal Revenue Service to pay for decades of back taxes and massive fraud penalties. The massive, opulent building that used to house my father's massive ego was sold at auction and turned into a community outreach program for at-risk youth. My parents faced massive public disgrace and total financial ruin. They managed to avoid federal prison by cooperating with the feds and testifying against Preston's associates, but they lost absolutely everything else. Their mansion was foreclosed, and their cars were repossessed. They were now living in a tiny, cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the dirty outskirts of the city. They were completely shunned by the elite society they once worshipped, and their former congregation treated them like pariahs. They had tried to call me a few times, leaving pathetic voicemails, begging for a second chance or a small loan. But I changed my number and never looked back. Preston was not so lucky. The federal prosecutor who helped me that Sunday morning did not offer him a single plea deal. His highly paid lawyers could do nothing against the mountain of physical and digital evidence I had gathered. He was found guilty on dozens of federal counts, including money laundering, bribery, racketeering, and the murder of my sister. He was currently sitting in a maximum security federal prison facing a 30-year sentence with absolutely no chance of early release. His wealth was completely gone, and the men in his cell block did not care about his elite status. But standing there on the peaceful green hill, none of that darkness mattered to me anymore. The federal family courts had officially granted me full permanent adoption of Arya. She was legally my daughter and the sole heir to my grandmother's restored trust fund. She had spent the last 6 months going to trauma therapy, healing from the horrors of her past, and finally learning how to be a normal, happy little girl. She was thriving in a beautiful new home we bought together in a quiet neighborhood filled with sunlight, bright colors, and a huge backyard for her to play in. The silence in our house was not heavy or oppressive. It was warm and full of love. Arya reached down and gently placed a single white lily against the polished granite headstone. She traced her mother's name with her small finger and whispered a quiet, sweet goodbye. Then she stood up and wrapped her small hand tightly around mine. She looked up at me with those beautiful, bright brown eyes, and a huge, genuine smile spread across her face. She asked, "Can we go home, Mommy Nyla?" Hearing her call me that filled my chest with a profound warmth that all the money or status in the world could never buy. I smiled back at her, squeezing her hand gently, and told her, "Yes, we are going home right now." We turned our backs to the grave and walked down the sunlit hill together. My parents spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was unworthy of love or respect because of the color of my skin and my refusal to play their twisted, manipulative games. They tried to break my spirit and use me as a stepping stone to build their own golden thrones. But a Black woman's worth is never defined by the broken, toxic people who try to keep her in the dark. True wealth is not found in offshore bank accounts, expensive designer gowns, or the fake applause of a megachurch congregation. True wealth is found in the courage to stand in your own undeniable truth, tear down the lies, and build a beautiful, authentic life on your own terms. I walked into the bright morning sun completely unbroken, holding the hand of my beautiful daughter, and feeling truly wealthy in every possible sense of the word. The greatest lesson we can take from this story is that blood does not automatically make someone family, especially when they use that connection to manipulate and break you. For too long, we are taught to shrink ourselves to protect the fragile egos of toxic relatives. But true power comes when you stop seeking validation from those who are committed to misunderstanding you. Your worth is not defined by the color of your skin or the labels they force upon you. True wealth is found in breaking generational curses, reclaiming your voice, and protecting your peace at all costs. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace, let me know in the comments below, and remember to hit like and subscribe for more stories of resilience.